Now, in the last tape I mentioned that we were having these pandal programs, big tent programs in India, where a kind of platform was made, and we would all walk up to that platform and then start doing a kirtan, and some of the people would touch our feet on our way up the platform, and Prabhupada warned us not to allow that to happen. So we fixed that by making a wider walkway so that we were far enough away from the crowd so none of them could touch our feet. But the instruction was that you should not allow people to touch your feet because you will be accepting their sins, and Prabhupada actually said this will make you get very sick or fall down or both. So this became a big issue after Prabhupada left. 11 of his followers started having their feet washed, and all kinds of people were touching their feet, and they were accepting the sins of thousands of people, and as a result, many of these 11 people became sick and fell down, just exactly as Prabhupada had warned against. Now, when we were in Vrindavan, a few devotees wandered off and began to associate with some of the Radhakund Babajis. The Radhakund Babajis are people who are claiming to be pure devotees and eligible to discuss the conjugal pastimes of Radha and Krishna, things like that. But many times they are fallen down and engage in illicit behavior, taking drugs, illicit sex, this type of thing. So Prabhupada was very alarmed that some of his followers were attracted to this, what he called Sahaja philosophy. So he told us, these Radhakund Babajis, they think they're living in Radhakund, but they're living in Naraka Kund. Naraka means hell. So he was very upset that some of us might be attracted to this type of thing, prematurely discussing Radha Krishna pastimes with these Babajis and accepting them as some type of authority. Unfortunately, after Prabhupada departed, some of the ISKCON leaders began to associate with these Babajis, and some of them still are associated with those Babajis. Now, when we went to Jaipur, there was a queen there, the Rani of Jaipur, and she allowed us to stay on the palace grounds in some building there, and she was very nice, and she liked Prabhupada a lot, and we had some very ecstatic kirtans. There's a temple there, and many local people came and joined kirtan with us, and we had just, hundreds of people engaged in kirtan with us. It was very, very nice. The queen offered a piece of property to Prabhupada, and we went and looked at that, and and Prabhupada approved of that. But then later she changed her mind, and she wanted to give us a lesser property. And so Prabhupada just said, never mind, we don't want anything. And so some of the people on our party, some of the devotees, they were upset. They said, Prabhupada, we should accept the lesser property. And so Prabhupada, he told us a story. He said, he told his father that he had wanted two toy guns when he was a child. And the father went out and got one toy gun. And Prabhupada says, never mind, I don't want the one gun, I wanted the two guns. So he told us this story. But anyway, Prabhupada was right, because what he was really saying was the queen is unreliable. She's offered us one property, now she's offering us a lesser property, and who knows, she could change her mind again. She's not reliable. So this was another thing that I began to realize. Very few Indians were joining us. There were a few. And the main help we were getting from the Indians, they were becoming life members. They were supporting financially, which was good. They were offering some money, but very few were actually joining and participating. That's what we really needed. We needed some people to come and really help with the program and help manage the program. And then I saw that this queen was, offering help and then changing it up. And so I was a little disappointed that the Indian people were not coming forward to support Prabhupada the way I felt would have justified his position. He should have got more support. I was also a little surprised how foolish some of the gurus were in India. When we were in Delhi, we went to one big guru's ashram, and there was a table where his devotees came and offered him different articles. And I noticed on the table there was some Marlboro cigarettes. and some cigarette lighters. So they were offering him some American cigarettes which were superior to the beedis. In India, people smoke a beedi, which is like a rolled up tobacco leaf. So obviously American cigarettes were like some luxury commodity in India. So his disciples were thinking, if we give him Marlboro cigarettes, this is like a fantastic gift to the Guru. And after we left, Prabhupada was chuckling and laughing about that, and he said, yeah, just see how foolish people are to accept such a person as a guru. We also went to another program where there was a guru sitting on one end, and there was like a long walkway, and we were all sitting on either side of this walkway, and the Prabhupada was sitting on the other end on a seat. So there was a guru sitting on a seat on one side, Prabhupada seated on the other side. And this other guru had taken a vow of silence. He hadn't spoken in 14 years, but he would write things down on a blackboard. He would say, bring me, a cup of water, or whatever. He would write instructions to his followers. So Prabhupada said, this man is a cheater. He says he's silent, but, as soon as he needs something, he writes on a blackboard. So he's not really taking a vow of silence. He's writing everything on this board. And so Prabhupada began to publicly challenge this man, which surprised me that, we were invited to this program, and Prabhupada's right away insulting this so-called guru. And so what happened after a while, Prabhupada just kept, complaining about this man and criticizing, and so the man eventually became angry, and he stood up and stomped away. But as he was stomping away, Prabhupada said, just see, now he's angry. He's angry. So this proves that he's not detached, because now he's becoming upset by insults. So this was a good lesson for me. I realized Prabhupada was really not compromising with these Indian sadhus and gurus very much. He would write about them and speak about them in his lectures, and even when he met them in person, sometimes he would give them a headache. He would, confront them. So this was a good lesson for me. We shouldn't be so lackadaisical, just accepting all kinds of bogus gurus and just allowing them to go on with some kind of bogus worship. Prabhupada did not approve of this process. He wanted us to challenge these people, and so he was kind of trying to train us in that idea. Do not just blindly go along and accept a bunch of foolish people as gurus. But just like Krishna says, I reciprocate with people as they approach me accordingly. So Prabhupada was very harsh with some people, but he was very merciful with other people. So one old man came in, and he offered his obeisances to Prabhupada, and he said, I accept you as my guru. This old man was telling Prabhupada, you're my guru. And Prabhupada says, no, you are my superior. You're older than me, so you are my guru. So they were sort of joking with one another, but Prabhupada was very merciful to this man because the man was humble, and he was trying to be respectful to Prabhupada, so Prabhupada would reciprocate with this type of mood. If someone approached him with the right mood, then Prabhupada would be very humble and friendly. But if someone was bogus, then Prabhupada would be more upset and challenging. So one day, Prabhupada, we were sitting in his room, and he put his hand on the table, and he spread two fingers apart, and he began to walk those fingers forward and spreading them apart further and further. And he says, so what happens when we come to this position? In other words, his fingers were spread out as far as they could go, and we didn't know what to say, but he says, this is what happens. You fall, and then he made his hand move forward, and you fall over, and he made his fingers fall down under his hand. And he said, so this is the problem in India. They want material culture and they want spiritual culture. So they're moving forward. One step they're going here, material, one step they're going there, spiritual. And these things are spreading apart, so you can't keep walking if your legs are just spreading out every step you take. So Prabhupada was trying to say this is contrary. You can't go in both directions at once. You can't go spiritual and material simultaneously because they are different directions. And he said, so this is the problem in India. They want the Western, material culture, and they want their Hindu or, Vedic culture simultaneously. It doesn't work. You fall over. And he said this is the problem not only with India culture, but this is the hippies problem. The hippies, they want spiritual life, and then at the same time they want illicit sex, and they want drugs, and they want Western culture. So he says the hippies and the Indians are basically the same. They have the same problem. They want material and they want spiritual simultaneously, and it doesn't work. It does not work. You fall over and you get nothing. And so Prabhupada says, therefore the hippies are rejected by the materialists because, they have some spiritual idea. So the materialists don't like them. And they're rejected by the spiritualists because they still have too many material leanings and desires. So Prabhupada says, do not, be like these, the Hindus, the Hindu culture, and do not be like the hippies. The hippies and the Hindus are basically the same thing. So I kind of felt that too, because in India many of these sadhus, they smoke pot and this type of thing, so they kind of look like hippies, and Prabhupada said we have to be very careful not to try to merge these two cultures together. In other words, he was warning us, don't become too infatuated with the Hindu culture, because it's defective. It's the same basic flaw as the hippie culture. So another time, a man came in, a Hindu man, to see Prabhupada, and Prabhupada said, well, who do you worship? And the man said, I worship the God only. So Prabhupada became a little irritated with this man, and he said, which God do you worship? What God is that? Do you worship Krishna? Do you worship Shiva? Do you worship Ganesh? Do you worship, Durga? What is your system of worship? Can you tell us which God you're worshiping? And the man was kind of startled, and he didn't really have a reply. So again, Prabhupada was showing us the defect that you can't just worship all kinds of demigods and God all together and just say, I'm worshiping the God only, which is, unfortunately part of what happens in Hindu culture. They worship all kinds of demigods, they worship Krishna, they worship Vishnu, they worship Ma, which is Durga. So Prabhupada was not happy with this type of thing. You have to be very specific. You have to be sure you know who God is. Which God are you worshiping? And so this was another thing that he would do in India. He would kind of emphasize another defect of so-called Hindu religion, which is they worship all kinds of different gods and demigods, and they're not clear. They're not sure of the hierarchy of who is actually the superior God, the supreme God, what are the avatars of that God, and what are the demigods or lesser gods, you could say. So Prabhupada wanted us to understand that system very intricately, because without knowing that, you may not be worshiping the actual God. You might be worshiping a demigod, or worse, you might be worshiping some of these Hindu avatars, people claiming to be God, but they're just ordinary, mundane people. So this also amazed me that here we are, we're in India, we're a bunch of burned out hippies, and we're discussing the highest philosophy in the universe. We're discussing what's being discussed on Brahma Loka, Satya Loka, Indra Loka, the highest planets. We're discussing the philosophy of who is God, who is the controller and maintainer of the universe, and we're just a bunch of burned out hippies here. So this made me feel very, very fortunate. I understood. I was definitely getting some special mercy from God. I'm able to even think about what is the Vaikuntha planets, and what is Krishna Loka, and what is God doing. I'm able to even conceive of these things at all. It's like a miracle. And so this begged the question, why weren't more people interested? Why wasn't a lot of people flocking over, this is the highest thing, this is the greatest thing? why isn't there thousands of people accepting this and trying to participate in this in India? And Prabhupada personally told me, I preached for 40 years in India without much result. So he had tried very hard to promote the Krishna religion in India, and without much success. There just wasn't a lot of customers. So he said the hippies were his best customers. So I felt very, very fortunate. The hippies, who are like the really dregs of the society, just like Lord Chaitanya picks up the lowest of the society, well, we were certainly in that category. So for 40 years, Prabhupada says, I preached in India without much result, but he goes to the hippies, and at least some of them, a small group of us, were participating or trying to participate. Of course, who can participate with a pure devotee? This is not easy, but at least we were attempting, we were making some effort. So at least something was being done by us. Then Prabhupada also told us that meeting a pure devotee is just like a turtle coming up in the middle of the ocean and putting his head through a knothole in a piece of wood floating in the ocean. So this is, in other words, very rarely occurring event. You know, how often does a turtle float up and he finds his head in the middle of a knothole in a piece of wood? It's a very rare event. So, in other words, not many people will become Krishna devotees at any given time. There's a very slow sort of leakage of people going back to the spiritual kingdom out of the material world. It's not like there's a whole giant event like the Christians think there's going to be some sort of, millions of people are all of a sudden going to rise up and go back to heaven. It's just not like that. It's just a very gradual process. Slowly, by somehow or other, people come to realize they need to worship Krishna and get out of this world. It's a very rare thing. So I began to really appreciate that after being in India, because I'm thinking there's 1 billion people here, and how many of them are really coming and trying to surrender to Prabhupada and surrender to this process and participate. There's just, very, very small number of people. Now, another thing I remember in India, one of the kirtans, I began to feel, I had my eyes closed, and I really began to feel like I was just flying at a very high rate of speed out of this universe. I was flying away from, I just lost all my bodily identification and just had pretty much forgot about this world, and I was moving out of here. And it was a very ecstatic and emotional experience for me, which I will never forget. So I think Krishna gave me that because I've never forgotten that, and therefore, no matter how bad it gets in this world, I always go back to remembering that point where I was leaving this world, and when I came back to my bodily consciousness, I was very surprised that I was still here. It was definitely like an out-of-body experience. So it reminded me of how sometimes Krishna gives a sign to different devotees. He appears to them, and then he just doesn't reappear again, but he wants them to know, he wants them to stay on the path. So I think Krishna gave me a certain, it was like a vision of sorts. But anyway, it was a very powerful experience, which I think Krishna gave me as a blessing to be like an anchor for my mind, to remember this is where you're going to eventually be. You're going to be flying out of this universe. That's what this is all going to come to eventually. Now, one of the things that Prabhupada was doing in India, he was allowing men and women in his party. So apparently this isn't done very often in India, or had not been done very much up until that time. But we went to Madras, and some of the godbrothers of Prabhupada, Swami Yati Maharaj and others, they went to the newspapers to complain that Prabhupada had a woman in his party. So but this was something I found very unusual. Instead of appreciating that Prabhupada was bringing Krishna to the West and bringing it to men and women in the West, they were upset. They were actually not happy that he was spreading Krishna to the Western boys and girls. They didn't like that. So I began to realize that here's another layer, there's kind of layers and layers of problems that Prabhupada is having. On the one hand, there's not many people, not many customers for Krishna, and on the other hand, if he gets a few customers, then some of the other so-called Krishna devotees are going to oppose him and give him a headache and try to basically stop what he's doing by even going to the newspapers and complaining. We don't like what he's doing. I think Yati was a disciple of Tirtha Maharaj, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway, so Prabhupada responded. He went back to the newspaper. He said, every year Yati Maharaj is seen dancing in front of thousands of widows. So he associates with women himself. And Prabhupada said, at least I'm trying to get the woman in my party married, whereas Swami Yati is dancing with unmarried women. So Prabhupada had a good kind of a comeback for this man. But anyway, like I could see now, there was some real problem here that the Krishna devotees, the so-called Krishna devotees in India, were not necessarily supporting Prabhupada. They weren't encouraging. Rather, they were trying to find fault, criticize, harass, and even tackle him down by going to the media, just to take down what he was doing, stop what he was doing. So this was a big problem he had with his so-called God brothers. So this, once again, was a great benediction for me to see all this, because later on some of my own God brothers wanted to tackle me down, take me down, and even have me killed. These were my so-called God brothers. So when I saw how Prabhupada's God brothers were treating him, when I was later on mistreated by my God brothers, I felt this is a perfect fit situation. I'm actually following right exactly in the same pattern that occurred to Prabhupada. So it gave me courage and understanding of the situation, that your own God brothers may become your worst opponents. So to see that firsthand was a very, very good instruction and practical example for me to see. Now, this dispute between Prabhupada and his God brothers didn't just start as soon as he came to India. There was an ongoing dispute where he, ever since the 1930s, had challenged their guru successor program. He just didn't agree with it. He did not agree that any gurus had been appointed in the Gaudiya Math. So I do believe that Krishna wanted me to see this firsthand, because Srila Prabhupada did not accept that the guru appointment of the Gaudiya Math ever occurred. He simply said, none of my God brothers were appointed as gurus. And so later in ISKCON, when my God brothers did what his God brothers did, they also claimed to be appointed successors, I already knew right away. Srila Prabhupada had already made it very clear. He did not accept the appointment of gurus. He didn't agree with their whole system. So when this came about in ISKCON, that we were appointed as the successors, Prabhupada had already given me first-hand insight into how and why that is a deviation, especially true because in 1978 the leaders of ISKCON went straight away to the Gaudiya Math, to the founder of the appointed guru program, namely Sridhar Maharaj. So I knew I was onto something right away in 1978 because of the going way back, where Prabhupada had instructed us over and over again that the Gaudiya Math had no appointed gurus. So this was Krishna's way of giving me an insight into the problem so that I would be able to cope and deal with it later on. But another important item that came up here was that the Gaudiya Math folks were criticizing Prabhupada for allowing women and men to be living together in his temples, and they also criticized that Prabhupada was allowing women to do pujari work, deity work, and things like that. So, in other words, his God brothers had no idea of how life is in the Western countries. You can't separate men and women apart in a temple. It's just not going to work. You can't just have men living in a temple. And if you have a policy that women are forbidden to live in a temple in the West, you'll be considered as anti-feminist and all these kinds of things. It's just not going to work. You have to allow a woman. That's for starters. Plus, Prabhupada had many, many other innovative things that he did to preach in the West, which were never accepted by most of the Gaudiya Math's people. They just did not accept his process. So he adjusted things. He adjusted his preaching so that he would be able to preach to the Westerners in the West. And this was one of the important issues. He had to bring women into the temples, or else it just wouldn't work. So their idea didn't work. They were unable to preach in the West because they did not understand how Western culture actually works. Now, another important thing in regards to women living in ISKCON, if you think about it, in India, you can have a temple just run by men and the woman can visit, because the women are going back to their home, and their home has some form of Vedic culture going on in India. The Indian culture is sympathetic to the Vedic idea. So a woman can visit a temple, worship Krishna, and go home and worship Krishna in her home in India. That's more or less acceptable. But in the West, you really have to take people out of the Western society situation and isolate them and put them into a separate environment. You need to bring the men, the women, the children. Everybody has to be participating in the temple. The temple is like a separate atmosphere from the Western culture. So that's what Prabhupada wanted to do. He wanted to make what he called Vaikuntha atmospheres of, like a little shelter, a little way station where people could go and take shelter away from the Western culture in his temples. So he had a whole plan for that. And it was working good. The men came, the women came, and they were all making advancement simultaneously in Krishna consciousness. That was his plan, and his plan was working. In any case, the real root issue, the real root debate was the Gaudiya Math people attacked Prabhupada's preaching and made all kinds of excuses why they didn't like it, but the real reason was he did not accept their guru's system. That was really the main thrust of the dispute. He did not agree that his godbrothers were gurus or had been appointed as gurus or whatever it was. And so he even wrote a letter saying, amongst my godbrothers, no one is qualified to be acharya. He simply did not accept their system. What he said was, my godbrothers deviated because they were supposed to just simply manage the institution on behalf of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta and not make their own independent guru programs. It just wasn't authorized, and they had the same problems as my godbrothers had. Many of those gurus were falling down and having scandals and so many things. So Prabhupada wanted us to avoid that in ISKCON, and so he preached about that when we were in India. He made this very clear: do not come to the same point as the Gaudiya Math came to. So Prabhupada was very clear on this point. Under no circumstances would he compromise with the idea that conditioned souls were Krishna's successors. Krishna is God. His successor must be as pure as God. He was very adamant on this point. And Prabhupada made many adjustments to many different things. But on this issue, he would never budge or compromise. You have to worship a pure devotee. There's no alternative. You must worship Krishna's actual representative. So I decided to go ahead and preach the same principle. The guru must be a pure representative of God, and so when my godbrothers started saying, no, gurus fall down, gurus have problems, gurus are conditioned souls, I said, no, that's not right.